Zellers is back. New stores, lineups before the doors open. 3 generations of the same Canadian family walking through the entrance together on opening day. And that's the part that doesn't make any sense. Because this is a store that was sold off, stripped down, and handed to an American chain that came into Canada, spent billions of dollars, and shut down every single location within 2 years. The people who sold Zellers went bankrupt in 2025. Their stores are dark. Their name is gone. So how is Zellers, the one they all left for dead, the one that's still standing? That's the question this video answers. And by the end of it, you'll understand not just why Zellers collapsed, but why what's happening right now in 2026 is either the most unlikely comeback in Canadian retail history or a warning sign that nobody is paying attention to yet. On August 4th, 1928, a man named Walter Philip Zeller opened a discount store at 176 Dundas Street in London, Ontario. 7,000 square feet. 21 departments. 60 employees on opening day. The pitch was simple, honest prices for thrifty Canadians. No markup disguised as prestige, just useful things at a fair price. Within months, an American firm called Schulte United bought him out. That would have been the end of most stories. But in 1931, Schulte United went bankrupt, a casualty of the Depression, and Walter Zeller walked back in and repurchased his stores. He rebuilt the chain from the wreckage of the American company that had taken it from him. That pattern, built Canadian, absorbed by Americans, reclaimed from the ruins, would repeat itself across a century, just with higher stakes each time. The chain grew steadily through the 1950s and 60s. By the mid-1970s, Zellers was a genuinely national retailer. When its American partner W.T. Grant collapsed in 1976, Zellers absorbed the hit, executed a reverse takeover of a rival Western chain called Fields, and emerged larger and more Canadian than before. Then, in 1978, Hudson's Bay Company, one of the oldest corporations in North American history, purchased Zellers outright. Under Hudson's Bay Company's ownership, Zellers had access to capital and infrastructure it had never possessed as an independent company. And for a time, the combination worked better than anyone had expected. By the late 1980s, Zellers was not a store Canadians chose. It was a store they went to. The distinction matters. Choosing implies alternatives. Going implies habit. And Zellers had become a habit as embedded in the weekly routine of Canadian families as the gas station on the corner or the post office on Main Street. The stores averaged 94,000 square feet, large enough to hold everything a family needed under one roof. Clothing, home goods, toys, seasonal merchandise. And in most locations, a Zellers family restaurant where you could get lunch at a price that would seem impossible today. Then there was Zeddy. Introduced in 1986 as a mascot for Toyland, the store's toy section, Zeddy was a teddy bear that by the early 1990s had outgrown that purpose entirely. Children recognized him before they could read the Zellers logo. He hosted birthday parties in-store, with an actual employee in a full Zeddy costume running the event. He had his own ride, the Zeddy Wheel, a miniature Ferris wheel near the entrance that cost $1 and played carnival music. Even when no child was riding it, the Zeddy Wheel spoke, "Come ride with me, all aboard the Zeddy Wheel." The voice never changed, in stores across the country. For years. That is the definition of a brand that has embedded itself into the sensory memory of a generation, not through advertising spend, but through repetition and physical presence that showed up exactly where Canadian families already were. Alongside Zeddy came Club Z, a points-based loyalty program that preceded the digital loyalty revolution by decades. You collected points on every purchase and redeemed them for merchandise. It wasn't complicated, but it made every transaction feel like a relationship. You weren't just shopping at Zellers, you were a member. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, is worth billions in customer retention when you execute it consistently over decades. And above all of it was the slogan, where the lowest price is the law. Not a promise, not a goal. The law. 6 words that communicated everything the brand stood for without requiring a single explanation. You walked in, you saw the price, and you knew the store had already done the work of making sure nobody else was beating it. By 1999, Zellers operated 350 locations across Canada. It employed more than 35,000 people. It was the dominant discount retailer in the country, Canada's version of what Kmart had been in America. Not just a store, but infrastructure. A fixed point in the geography of ordinary Canadian life that families built their weekly routines around without ever consciously deciding to. But the comparison to Kmart was not just structural. It was also a warning nobody read in time. Before we get into how it all fell apart, if you've made it this far, you already know this channel covers Canadian business stories that don't get told anywhere else. Subscribe and drop a comment below telling us if you remember shopping at Zellers. We read every single one. Walmart arrived in Canada in 1994 by acquiring 122 Woolco stores. Instantly national, immediately formidable, and built on a supply chain system that Zellers simply could not match. Walmart's inventory technology, connected by satellite to every store in its network, tracked every product in real time. When something sold fast, it was automatically reordered. When something sat too long, the system flagged it. The shelves were full because the system demanded it. Zellers ran on a substantially more manual process. The result, increasingly visible to any Canadian who shopped at both chains through the early 2000s, was a Zellers store where you sometimes found what you came for and sometimes didn't. The popular size was gone. The seasonal item had sold out with no reorder placed. The shelf was half empty and nobody seemed to know when it would be restocked. A customer who drives to a store and does not find what she came for does not file a complaint. She does not write a letter. She just drives to Walmart next time. And then the time after that. And the time after that. Until Zellers stops being the default and becomes the backup. In retail, the backup is a terminal position. You do not lose customers in a single dramatic moment. You lose them in 100 small disappointments, each one too minor to mention, accumulating quietly over years into a habit of going somewhere else. By the mid-2000s, many Zellers locations were also showing their age. Fixtures hadn't been updated. The energy that had made those stores feel alive in the 1990s was fading. Not gone, but fading. And in retail, the moment a customer starts feeling like the place is tired, the clock has already started. In Hudson's Bay Company's final year as a publicly traded company, Zellers had 291 stores and lost $107 million on sales of $4.2 billion. Let that land. $4.2 billion in revenue. 35,000 employees. Still losing money. The brand was real and deep, but the operational model had failed to keep pace with a competitor that hadn't arrived with a better product, just a better system. By 2008, Hudson's Bay Company had been taken private by a New York-based private equity firm whose attention was on repositioning the Bay as a fashion-forward department store. Zellers, in that vision, was a drag, not an asset, a problem to be solved. The solution came in a phone call from Target. In January 2011, Hudson's Bay Company announced it would sell the lease agreements for up to 220 Zellers stores to Target Corporation for $1.825 billion. The financial press called it strategic. The analysts nodded. Hudson's Bay Company extracted nearly $2 billion from a division that had been losing money. The math looked clean. What the math didn't account for was what those 220 leases actually represented, not just retail square footage. The weekly routine of millions of Canadian families. The communities where Zellers had been, for years, the largest single employer on the block. The 35,000 people who showed up every morning and knew where everything was. Hudson's Bay Company retained 64 Zellers locations. Then in July 2012, it announced those would be liquidated and closed too. Every single one by March 31st, 2013. The last real Zellers closed that year. A handful of liquidation outlets ran until January 2020 when the final ones shut. The Zeddy wheel went quiet. Club Z points expired. The slogan was retired without ceremony. And Target. Target Canada opened its first stores in 2013. By January 2015, every single one was closed. The chain had burned through more than $2 billion and failed so completely that its collapse became a Canadian business school case study in what not to do. Supply chain chaos. Shelves that sat empty. A brand that Canadians had known from cross-border shopping trips and arrived expecting one experience and got something entirely different. The leases Hudson's Bay Company had sold as a strategic exit became a graveyard. Walmart, which had been quietly absorbing Zellers customers for nearly 2 decades, absorbed the rest. The circle closed. Zellers was gone. Target was gone. And the physical evidence of that collapse was everywhere. Enormous flat-roofed buildings sitting dark behind cracked parking lots, built to a scale that assumed a kind of Canadian commercial life that was no longer arriving to fill them. Here is the part the hook promised. In 2025, Hudson's Bay Company filed for creditor protection. The company that had owned Zellers, sold it to Target, and watched Target fail, was itself collapsing. its department stores went dark across the country. The Bay, one of the oldest retail names in Canadian history, was gone. So the chain, Hudson's Bay Company, sold for $1.825 billion in 2011, had now outlived Hudson's Bay Company itself. And in that collapse, a Quebec-based retailer called Les Zellers de la Mode, the parent company behind Fairweather and International Clothiers, moved quickly. The Bonita family acquired the Zellers trademarks from Hudson's Bay's creditors. The logo, the name, the rights to Zeddy, the Club Z loyalty program. Court documents suggest the purchase price may have been as low as $100,000. The family has never confirmed the figure. In October 2025, the first new Zellers opened at Londonderry Mall in Edmonton, occupying a former Hudson's Bay anchor space, smaller than the old stores, between 20,000 and 50,000 square feet. Apparel, home goods, seasonal items. The format was leaner, but the ethos was the same: affordable, accessible, family first. The Edmonton store exceeded expectations. In January 2026, the Bonita family announced national expansion. On June 18, 2026, a crowd burst through the doors of a new Zellers at 80 Orpheus Road in North York, Toronto. A 25-foot inflatable Zeddy bear stood outside. The Zeddy mascot appeared in person. A Zellers Diner on Wheels food truck was parked at the entrance. Kiddie rides returned. A customer named Marie Boudriaz was interviewed outside. She said, "My daughter is 45. When she was a baby, I used to buy at Zellers. And now my granddaughter is 2, and we will come back to buy clothes for her. Isn't that something else, how the circle turns around?" A second Ontario location opens at Tecumseh Mall in Windsor in July 2026. More locations are being confirmed across the country through a phased national rollout. This is Zellers 3.0, not a nostalgia play. A reimagining of the original model for a retail landscape that has changed completely, and a Canadian consumer who, in 2026, needs value more urgently than at any point in recent memory. Nostalgia gets people through the door for the first visit. It does not keep them coming back on the 3rd or the 14th or the 42nd. For that, the product has to be right, the price has to hold, and the experience has to deliver something the alternatives don't. Walmart is cheaper on staples but enormous and impersonal. Target failed here and hasn't come back. Amazon is faster but has no Zeddy wheel, no parking lot, no moment of discovery that comes from walking an aisle without a list. The timing is working in Zellers 3.0's favor in a way it hasn't for a Canadian discount retailer in years. Inflation has compressed the budgets of Canadian families more severely and for longer than almost any point in recent memory. Dollarama is thriving precisely because that economic pressure exists, because people still want to walk into a store and fill a basket without anxiety. That pressure hasn't eased, it's gotten worse. The Bonita family built Fairweather and International Clothiers into viable national brands. They understand Canadian retail. The smaller format, 20,000 to 50,000 square feet, is not a limitation, it's a strategy. Nimble, low overhead, sustainable in malls that have lost their anchors and need foot traffic again. But here is the warning sign the hook mentioned. Zellers has been here before. It peaked. It faded. The people who owned it stopped seeing a community institution and started seeing a real estate portfolio. The brand survived not because the business model was protected, but because the name was cheap enough that someone eventually picked it back up off the floor. The pattern is worth stating plainly. Every time Zellers hit its ceiling, what followed was not a thoughtful pivot or a bold reinvention. It was a transaction. Someone sold something. Someone else came in with money and ambition and plans. And the people who had actually built the customer relationships, the cashiers, the stock clerks, the managers who knew where everything was, bore the cost of decisions made in rooms they were never invited into. Zellers 3.0 is different in one important way. For the first time in decades, the people running it chose to acquire this brand rather than inherit it through a corporate shuffle. The Bonita family saw Hudson's Bay Company collapse and moved deliberately to pick up the trademarks. That is a different kind of commitment than a parent company that ends up with a discount chain it doesn't quite know what to do with. But commitment and execution are not the same thing. The nostalgia is real. The economic timing is favorable. The smaller format is smart. What remains unproven is whether Zellers 3.0 can build the supply chain discipline, the inventory systems, and the consistent in-store experience that turned the original Zellers from a store people visited into a store people returned to out of habit. Dollarama took years to build that kind of operational muscle. Fairweather and international clothiers operate on a very different model than a multi-category discount retailer. The Bonitas are capable operators, but capable in a narrower lane than what Zellers 3.0 is asking them to drive. The lineups in North York and Edmonton are real. The question is whether they're still there 18 months from now, on a Tuesday in February, when there's no inflatable bear and no food truck and no opening day energy. Just a store, open, asking Canadians to make it part of their weekly routine again. That is the only test that matters. And it hasn't happened yet. Walter Zeller opened his first store in 1928 and lost it within months to an American company. He got it back in 1931 when that company collapsed. He built it again from nothing, on Canadian terms, with Canadian customers, for Canadian families who just needed somewhere honest to buy the things they needed. The pattern has now run its full cycle. Target, gone. Hudson's Bay, gone. The brand itself, back in Canadian hands for the first time in nearly 50 years, smaller and sharper and far more self-aware about what it is than either of the corporate owners that preceded it. 3 generations of the same family walked into the North York store on June 18, 2026. The grandmother remembers buying clothes there for her daughter in the 1980s. Her daughter is 45 now. Her granddaughter is 2, no memory of Zeddy, no concept of Club Z points, no idea what it meant to stand in the layaway line in November with a deposit in an envelope. But she walked through those doors. And that 2-year-old is exactly who Zellers 3.0 needs to win over. Not just the nostalgic generation who misses what the store used to be. The next generation who has no reason to care, unless the store gives them one. That is the real bet the Bonita family is making. Nostalgia is the entry point, not the destination. The destination is a Tuesday in February 2028, when the opening day energy is a memory and it's just a store, and a Canadian family walks in anyway because this is where they go. Whether that Tuesday arrives is the story we'll be watching. That's the full Zellers story, but we want to hear yours. Drop your Zellers memory in the comments. The Zeddy wheel. The Club Z card. The family restaurant. Whatever it was. Because the more specific those memories are, the more they tell us about what this brand actually meant to Canadians and what it needs to deliver to survive what comes after the nostalgia fades. Subscribe so you don't miss the follow-up. Because in 12 months, we'll know whether Zellers 3.0 is a real comeback or just the most expensive nostalgia trip in Canadian retail history.